Okay. So, good evening, everybody. And I just want to say that, I always like our sessions to be discussions. Okay. So, I'm sure I'm perfectly capable of lecturing for an hour, but I'd be more interested in some sort of interchange of ideas. But let me kick the discussion off. So just to refresh people's memories, or to bring them up to speed if they weren't there, we actually, and I look back to see when it was, in December of 2021, we had a class which I called the Evolving Conservative Attitude Towards Intermarriage. Okay, so I don't want to rehash all of that, but there's some history that helps as a background for our discussion, and it's rather, frankly, from my perspective, rather surprising history. But this is a combination of like United Synagogue policies and rabbinical assembly policies. Until the mid 1960s, a Jew married to a non-Jew could not be a member of a conservative synagogue. Right? I want to repeat that. All right. Forget about whether the spouse of a Jew, the non-Jewish spouse of a Jew or whatever. The Jewish person married to a non-Jew could not be a member of a conservative synagogue until sometime in the mid 1960s. And as late as the mid 1980s, there was a ruling from the law committee, from the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly, mid 1980s, that a Jew married to a non-Jew could not have an aliyah, could not be called to if you were a Jew married to a non-Jew, you could not be called to the Torah, nor could you be given any position in the synagogue that could be construed as a role model. Okay, so that meant, and like specifically enumerated were like Hebrew school teachers and youth group advisors and so on and so forth. If you were a Jew married to a non-Jew, you could not have those roles in a conservative synagogue. All right, so that's the history that we discussed, a little over a year ago. In 1990, and I remember this very clearly because in 1990, Stan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I want to comment on that or ask a question about that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Could that Jew married to a non-Jew be married in a Jewish cemetery?
Be married in a Jewish cemetery?
I'm sorry, buried in the Jewish cemetery.
Could the Jew marry to? That depended on. I'm not familiar with any ruling or any discussion of that. I would say that I wouldn't see why that wouldn't be. But cemetery rules, most cemeteries, most Jewish cemeteries are not owned by shuls, right? And therefore they're not governed by shuls. They're owned by fraternal associations, or they're for-profit or whatever, and therefore shuls don't have a lot of say about what happens. I think so, but I'm not aware of any such discussion. I couldn't see why they wouldn't be. There's a lot of discussion about whether the non-Jewish partner of a Jew could be married in a Jewish cemetery, but that's not the question that you asked. All right, so I remember 1990 because I was working for Hillel at the time. and a demographic study called the NJPS, the National Jewish Population Study, came out, and this really started the panic over intermarriage in the American Jewish community. It showed a very large percentage of Jews who were marrying at the time were getting married to non-Jewish partners. I mean, somewhere roughly around 50%. I mean, and there was subsequently a lot of controversy around that survey because, of course, in order to determine what percentage of Jews are marrying non-Jews, you first have to define Jew, right? And so for example, the NJPS, as an example, counted anybody with one Jewish parent as a Jew, right? So, like, for example, I have two nieces who, my brother is Jewish, his ex-wife is not Jewish. They are not halachically Jewish. They were not raised as Jews. They do not consider themselves Jews. They are Unitarians. But if either of my nieces were to marry another non-Jew, because they're non-Jews, right? If either of my nieces were to marry another non-Jew, they would be counted by the NJPS as an intermarriage, as a Jew marrying a non-Jew, which is an absurd, it's absurd. So you have to kind of scrub the data. But clearly, it was, from in the 1960s, the intermarriage rate was somewhere around 15 or 20%, if that. And by the 90s, it was, somewhere around 50%. And this pushed all of the mainstream Jewish organizations into a panic. And the United Synagogue started publishing pamphlets. Again, I remember these. Here, Jewish parent, take this pamphlet, give this to your kid to convince them not to marry a non-Jew, right? That we will inoculate our kids from intermarriage by giving them these pamphlets published by the United Synagogue. It didn't work. But the agenda of the conservative movement was clearly to push endogamy, that is to say, in marrying or conversion. Again, the official party line was that if a Jew married a non-Jew, then the optimal result should be that the non-Jewish partner would convert to Judaism. And that's what we should be working towards. But over the last 30 odd years, the intermarriage rate continued to increase. And now, again, depending on how you define it, but let's say roughly around 70%, right? That is to say, roughly 70% of Jews who are getting married now are getting married to somebody who is not Jewish. Okay, it's a lot, right? And simultaneously, and you can't, I took 4 semesters of economics in college, and I remember almost nothing, but I do remember learning about the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Okay, A happens, then B happens, therefore A caused B. Well, maybe not, right? But we can say 2 things for sure. The intermarriage rate has continued to go up, and the market share of conservative Judaism has continued to go down. Does the one cause the other? Perhaps not, but certainly a lot of people believe that, right? And the Reform market share continues to grow at the expense of conservative Judaism. But again, this data, I don't want to say it's suspect, right? But you have to be careful what you do with it, right? Because if you look at, I mean, all of these surveys go by self-declaration. That is to say, are you Jewish? Yes. Do you identify with a Jewish denomination? Yes. In other words, they'll give you a choice. Reform, conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, renewal, secular, humanist, just Jewish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And it goes by self-identification, right? And so if you look at the number of Jews who call themselves Reform versus the number of Jews who actually pay dues to Reform synagogues, right? There's a lot more Jews who, right? I mean, and so people would say, well, I'm not very religious, so I guess I'm Reform, right? Doesn't necessarily mean they belong to Reform synagogues. I mean, if you look at, for example, the most recent Pew study, 5% of Orthodox Jews are married to non-Jews. Okay, now how can that be? Right? I mean, any Orthodox rabbi would say, per definition, if you're married to a non-Jew, you ain't Orthodox, right? But if you go by self-definition, so 5% of people who define themselves as Orthodox are married to non-Jews, and something like 12%, I don't know the exact figures, I didn't go back and look at them, but some non-negligible number of self-proclaimed Orthodox Jews don't keep kosher, right? Again, an Orthodox rabbi would tell you, if you don't keep kosher, you ain't Orthodox, right? So, but, having said that, Reform Judaism, I believe, is more attractive to Jews and their non-Jewish partners than conservative Judaism is as a whole, right? For the following reason: Reform rabbis increasingly officiate at intermarriages. I would say it's certainly at this point well over 50% of Reform rabbis. And I would tell you that, friends of mine who are Reform rabbis say, if you are a Reform rabbi who doesn't officiate at intermarriages and you have a job, keep your job, right? Because you will not find a new pulpit if you don't officiate at intermarriages. You just won't. So Reform rabbis increasingly officiate at intermarriage. Reform Judaism has patrilineal descent, right? That is to say, if you have a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, you can be recognized as Jewish in Reform Judaism without a formal conversion. Now, people think that this means that if you have one Jewish parent, you're automatically Jewish. And that's not what the official position of Reform Judaism actually is. The official position is, if you have one Jewish parent and you are raised with an exclusive Jewish identity, you are Jewish. Okay, so that in theory, you could have somebody who is considered Jewish in conservative or Orthodox Judaism and not considered Jewish in Reform Judaism, right? Because they have a Jewish mother, but were not raised as a Jew, right? Or they have a Jewish mother, but were actually raised as a Christian, right? From the perspective of halakha, as we understand it, this is a Jew who was raised as a Christian, Madeleine Albright, right? But from the perspective of Reform Judaism, this person would be not Jewish, at least at least in theory, right? But it's certainly in terms of like not requiring conversion for a kid who has a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. Reform temples have few to no rules that would limit participation of non-Jewish relatives in Jewish life cycle events, right? So that, you know, you are a Jew married to a non-Jew, let's say, and you want to come up on Friday night, light the candle, have your non-Jewish husband say the Kiddush on the bima, not a problem. You want to come up together for an aliyah, both of you together, not a problem, right? There are very few to no rules that limit the participation of non-Jewish relatives in life cycle events. Okay, so all of these things I think are, I think objectively mean that it is much less challenging to be an intermarried Jew in a Reformed congregation than to be an intermarried Jew in a conservative congregation, right? I mean, I think that is, and I mean this as a sort of objective description, because, you know, from my perspective, Jews married to non-Jews who are members of conservative congregations are heroes, all right, because they have put up with lots of unwelcoming messages, right, over the years, right, and have been told, you know, this isn't your place, you don't belong here, and they've said, no, this is our place and we do belong here, and they've put up with a lot. So I do not mean at all to criticize members of conservative shuls who are married to non-Jews, quite the opposite. But I'm just describing why it seems to me objectively it would be less difficult and less challenging to be a member of a Reform congregation. Okay, so the United Synagogue in the last 5 years or so has started to adapt to the current reality. So in 2017, the United Synagogue took a vote and changed its own constitution or charter or bylaws, I'm not sure exactly which. But up until 2017, the United Synagogue said that a conservative shul could not allow a non-Jew to be a full member of the synagogue. All right. That is to say, if you have a two-parent family and one of the parents is not Jewish, at least technically, they could not join as a family. They would have to join as a single, and pay the single dues rate and so on and so forth. In 2017, the United Synagogue said that congregations could allow non-Jewish spouses to be members if they wish to do so. All right, they allowed this, they did not require it. Okay, and then in 2018, the Rabbinical Assembly clarified that its standard of rabbinic practice allows rabbis to attend but not participate in intermarriage ceremonies. Okay, and here I need to back up and unpack this a little bit. Okay, so because I throw around terminology that I assume everybody understands, right? But what makes a conservative shul a conservative shul, right? from the perspective of the official conservative movement, it is the shul is a member of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. That's what makes it a conservative shul, right? And what makes a conservative rabbi a conservative rabbi? That you are a member of the rabbinical assembly, right? It doesn't matter where you went to school, right? I did not go to JTS. I went to HUC, but I'm a conservative rabbi because I belong to the RA, right? Where there are other rabbis in the area who went to school at JTS, but they became Reform, and they're members of what's known as the Central Conference of American Rabbis. At any rate, so, we have this principle in conservative Judaism called Mara Da'atra, right? Mara Da'atra means that the rabbi of a synagogue is the halachic authority for that synagogue, right? But we also have a law committee, right? The Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. Now, what does this mean? It means that essentially when the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards issues an opinion, it's advisory, right? It's not, right? It's guidance, it's not legislations, right? So, 2 years ago, when the pandemic first hit and, the law committee said, you can't use Zoom on Shabbat. And I said, we have to use Zoom on Shabbat. And we did. And I was allowed to make that decision because the law committee's position was not binding, right? But there are certain binding positions called standards of rabbinic practice. Okay, and it's complicated, but it has to be unanimously passed by the law committee and then ratified as a standard of rabbinic practice by an 80% vote of the membership of the RA at a convention. Or actually now we do our voting online. But if something is a standard of rabbinic practice, then it becomes obligatory, okay? And you are not, and if you violate a standard of rabbinic practice, you can be kicked out of the rabbinical assembly, all right? And essentially, I mean, the main standards of rabbinic practice are not to officiate at an intermarriage, not to officiate at a remarriage of a Jew who has been previously married to a Jew and hasn't either given or received a get, a religious Jewish divorce, or acceptance of patrilineal descent. Okay, and up until 2018, it was believed that part of the standard of rabbinic practice vis-a-vis intermarriage was that you could neither officiate nor even attend. Okay, you could not attend an intermarriage. But at the same time, that part of the standard was routinely violated for close relatives. Like, I went to my brother's wedding, right? And I remember asking the head of the RA at the time, and I remember this discussion word for word, even though it's more than 20 years ago. I said, Joel, can I really be kicked out of the RA for going to my own brother's wedding? And he said, listen to me very carefully, right? I cannot tell you that you can attend. What I can tell you is that in order to be found guilty, you would have to be brought up on charges. And it is inconceivable to me that somebody would bring you up on charges for attending your own brother's wedding. And Alan.
Rabbi, thank you. You started this off today by saying that you'd like to have a discussion. And
I do.
you're telling us now, is a review of what you told us in December. You and I went to, and I'm not going to blame you for it in front of people, but you and I went to the Ramonim seminar today,
Right.
and it was interesting to me. Not that I want to go every time, but it was interesting to me. And what they were saying, and this really goes for those folks here who are on the futures, I mean, on the planning committee too, that really, and what you said here, we have not been welcoming enough to spouses. Right. And you start talking about, well, the reform folks are getting a little more, better numbers. Well, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. And it made me think that we really, as a synagogue, have, I don't want to say failed, but we haven't done all that we could do. And one of the things we want to do on this planning committee is to see how we'd be more attractive. And we had somebody in my breakout group who was talking about having a video on the website that talked about, blatantly talked about welcoming non-Jewish spouses, and that we are here for somebody who wants to follow more of the tradition than you might do, or in a different way than you might do if you're reform. So my thought, and I really would like a discussion on it, but how do you think, and how do other folks here think that we can be more welcoming, that it can be a better experience, and that we can have people who are not married to Jewish people, but are, but they're fine people and we'd like to be around them. And in my group, someone said, well, you can have the treasurer on your board of appeal, on your board of directors, doesn't have to be Jewish. It's different if you're talking about your ritual committee, or you can have somebody who's not Jewish in the men's club. And I thought to myself, if we can get anybody in the men's club, it's probably pretty good. But my thought would be, if we can have some discussion there and just see this, where we're going and what people think.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm getting to the Rimonim part. I mean, I just wanted us to be all on the same page, okay? Because I mean, it's easy to throw around ideas, right? But my topic is this going to split the movement, right? And therefore, I mean, there's a degree of kind of treading carefully. All right. So at any rate, but I will condense what I was going to say. Okay. So at any rate, in 2018, the RA clarified that the part of the standard of rabbinic practice that said you can't even attend an intermarriage was never properly passed. Okay. And since it was never properly passed, it doesn't exist, and therefore conservative rabbis can attend intermarriages but not participate. Okay. And then more recently than that, the United Synagogue hired an interfaith inclusion specialist who, Alan, you heard from today. Her name is Karen McGinnity. She is a PhD historian. She's written books about the history of intermarriage in America, and she was herself intermarried. I mean, and she's written articles about how, people are always, oh, McGinnity, that's not a Jewish name, whatever. Well, she's divorced from her non-Jewish husband, but she was intermarried, okay? And so, looking for ways to be more inclusive, more welcoming, more friendly. And the way that I would phrase it is, welcoming to all Jews and their family members, right? All Jews and their family members, right? But if you look, for example, at the statistics from our Hebrew school, right? And so when I talk about inclusion of Jews and their family members, it's not just inclusion of non-Jewish spouses, right? There's also the majority, I believe that the majority of kids in conservative schools today have non-Jewish grandparents, have non-Jewish cousins, right? I mean, if you look at the kids in our Hebrew school, right? Admittedly, a small number, okay, but 25% of the kids in our Hebrew school have two born Jewish parents. 25% of the kids in our Hebrew school have a born Jewish parent and a parent who converted to Judaism. And 50% of the kids in our Hebrew school have a Jewish parent and a non-Jewish parent, right? So that means that 75% of the kids in our Hebrew school have non-Jewish grandparents, right? 75% of the kids in our Hebrew school have non-Jewish cousins, right? So it's not just, I mean, you could have a family where both parents are Jewish, but you still have non-Jews in the extended family. You still have grandparents, right? What role can the non-Jewish grandparent play in a bar or bat mitzvah, right? So, and I don't think that our school is unique, right? I mean, it's simply not, right? So Alan mentioned this program called Rimonim, and actually, Alan, you can't attend further because today was the last session. But there were 6 sessions just for rabbis, and then session 7, each rabbi was asked to invite 1 or 2 lay leaders as well. I frankly, based on the content, I'm not sure exactly why. I don't know what was accomplished other than to sort of let you all know that this is happening. But the sessions are on how to create a culture of welcoming, right? So, for example, like I mentioned, inclusion of non-Jewish relatives in life cycle events, right? And how that can be accomplished. Membership practices, right? I mean, can a non-Jewish spouse be a member of the shul? And you have situations, I mean, you have to really be careful, because if you say a non-Jewish spouse can be a member, well, what happens if the Jewish spouse dies, right? But the kids are being raised Jewish, right? You now have kids being raised Jewish by a non-Jewish parent. Can the non-Jewish parent keep their membership? I would say yes, right? I mean, even though they're no longer currently, but I know, I mean, a colleague faced exactly this situation, right? It was a mixed marriage. The Jewish spouse died. The kids are still being raised as Jews, and now they can't be members of the shul anymore, right? I mean, it's a tragic situation, and you can't anticipate every possible eventuality, but these are the kind of things that happen, right? So, but simple things like I understand that for a long time, by administrative diktat, non-Jewish spouses of Jews were not listed in the membership directory. The birthdays of non-Jewish spouses were not included in the shofar. Mail from the shul went only to the Jewish spouse, right? These things, and I single-handedly changed this in my pulpit in York, Pennsylvania, because I said this is just gratuitously insulting, right? It doesn't accomplish anything other than just gratuitously insulting people, right? So, but membership practices and exploring that. Questions, for example, of an ufruf for an intermarriage, right? And I mean, I think there is a perception, because I've been here now almost 10 years, and I've not been asked, I've had discussions, well, I know you can't officiate, but this, that, never been asked about an ufruf. I think the presumption is that we would say no, so why even ask the question? But could there be an ufruf prior to an intermarriage? Again, for a long time, the United Synagogue said that you could not offer a family a mazel tov on their child's intermarriage, that you could not offer, grandparents a mazel tov on the birth of a non-Jewish grandchild, right? These things have changed, at least, on paper, although, synagogues are at different places, where how they're actually implemented. Questions of, interfaith sections in Jewish cemeteries, which we have, right? And I mean, talking about life cycle events. I mean, I have in the last few years done 2 funerals for non-Jews married to Jews in our congregation. I've done two of them, right? Because in both cases, I mean, these people were not Jewish, but they weren't members of any other religion, and to the extent that they had a congregation at all, this was their congregation, right? But it was a challenge to figure out a way, for me to do a funeral for a non-Jewish person, right? Questions of how to make services more accessible, right? And this is not, frankly, this is not just for non-Jewish spouses of Jews. I mean, we have plenty of Jews in the American Jewish community who walk into a conservative shul and have no idea what the heck is going on, right? Can we, but then you talk about, I mean, so this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Because can we make our services more accessible without turning off the people who like the services the way they are now, right? I mean, I can conduct a service that's 50% in English. I know how to read English, right? But what will that do to the nature of our shul, right? Will the people who come every Shabbos morning still come if the service is 50% in English, right? And if the answer to that is no, will we make up those losses somewhere else, right? So it's not always so easy, okay? But the biggest, barrier, I think, is officiation at intermarriage and acceptance of patrilineal descent, right? And both are currently against standards of rabbinic practice. As I mentioned, in 2018, when the RA decided that we could attend but not officiate at intermarriages, the way they did that was to say, well, the prohibition on attending was never properly voted on, and therefore it doesn't exist. Because there's no procedure to repeal or amend a standard of rabbinic practice. So in that same 2018 report, they said we have to come up with a procedure, but to my knowledge, they never did come up with any such procedure. Okay, so I sent out these 2 articles, right? So the first one was the new narrative, and that was by Karen McGinnity. And I don't know how many of you read or didn't read these articles, right? The second one was a response by Professor Jack Wertheimer, who's a professor of history at JTS, for a long time was the provost of JTS, who said we do not need a new narrative. Basically, intermarriage is bad for the Jewish people. What we need to do is figure out ways to prevent Jews from intermarrying. And if intermarried Jews want to join shuls, they can join Reform shuls, and the handful of intermarried Jews who do belong to conservative shuls are doing just fine. We don't really need to change anything to make them feel more welcome. Okay. I did get an email from one of the people whom I'm looking at who was, bothered by this article, and my response was, just because I sent out the article doesn't mean I agree with it, right? I mean, it would be pretty boring if I only gave you things to read, that I agree with. And in point of fact, I'm part of a group of 5 rabbis who are in Rimonim. We are drafting a response to Wertheimer, because I don't agree. I don't agree with him, right? But having said that, will we split? Look, I don't know. I mean, there's only so far that we can go within current norms, right? And Reform Judaism will always be more accessible, right? Now, interestingly, in my group, which was on life cycle events, one of the rabbis raised the point that rabbis can be more liberal than lay people sometimes, right? Because we look at halakha, whereas, so look, there is no halakha that says a non-Jew can't stand on the bima. There is no halakha that says a non-Jew can't touch the Torah, right? But there would be people who would be bothered by it, right? And I can give a less sort of controversial example. Okay, we have 2 churches that rent space from us, right? And one of them, when they first entered into the lease, they said, we would like to be able to serve food after our services on Sunday, right? And I was asked, is this permissible, right? And my response was, absolutely, it's permissible, right? Because, non-Jews are not expected to keep kosher, right? There's no such thing as kosher air or kosher tables or kosher trash cans, right? That as long as they don't prepare food in the kitchen and don't serve it on our utensils, right? Our responsibility is to make sure that the kitchen is kosher. It's not to make sure that the building is kosher, right? So because I'm looking at it from the perspective of halakha, right? If I'm a Jewish landlord, do I have to make sure that my non-Jewish tenants keep kosher in an apartment that I own? That's absurd, right? But when it got to the ritual committee, oh my God, right? You would have thought that I was advocating that we sacrifice pigs on the bima, right? If we allow this is not the shul I joined, I'm quitting, blah, 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 right? That's not a halachic position, okay? But I was asked a halachic question and gave a halachic answer, right? I'm not an expert on the subjective feelings of Jews or what your Bubby and Zadie would think, right? So on certain things, we can actually be more liberal than, let's say, our ritual committees, right? Which are often sort of, the guardians of tradition, real or imagined. So in terms of life cycle and so on and so forth, right? Now, all right, I'm going to stop here because Alan rightly said, let's have a discussion. I will reserve, a few minutes at the end to, share my own sort of thoughts on the matter, but I'll stop now and open up the floor. Yeah, Marilyn.
Okay. At one point you said something about, I think 70% responded to one survey about intermarriage.
Yeah.
Is there any follow-up on the children of those intermarriages, whether they become Jewish or non-Jewish?
Yeah, and that's where there's really good news, right? Is that 50% or more of children of intermarriage consider themselves to be Jews, okay, or are being raised to consider themselves as Jews, okay, which is way higher than it was in previous generations, right? Because I think really in, let's say, 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago, that a Jew who married a non-Jew was really seeking to shed their Jewishness, right? And this is clearly no longer the case, or it's certainly no longer necessarily the case, right? And so, look, I mean, when I was in rabbinical school, Jonathan Sarna, who at the time was teaching at HUC, now he's at Brandeis, and he is America's leading, he's the leading historian of American Jewry, and not a liberal on these issues at all, right? But he pointed out to me, he pointed out to our class that intermarriage can actually be a net numeric plus to the Jewish community, depending precisely on the answer to the question that you raised, right? Like let's assume a universe of 10, there are 10 Jews in a particular town, right? All 10 of them marry Jews, right? And each couple has 2 kids, right? In the next generation, you will have 10 Jewish kids, right? Because you will have 5 couples, each with 2 kids, right? I'm telling you, you're an accountant, right? You'll have 10 Jewish kids, right? If each of those 10 Jews marries a non-Jew, right? If half of those kids consider themselves Jewish, it's a wash, right? You've still got 10 Jews in the next generation. If all of those kids consider themselves Jewish, you've got 20 Jews in the next generation rather than 10, right? That, I mean, your population has doubled in 1 generation. If you can somehow convince all of those families to raise their kids as Jews, and the kids see themselves as Jews in accordance with their parents' wishes, right? So, you know, but all of these things are very, very fuzzy, right? Because you have, you know, more than 50% of intermarried Jews who say, my kid is being raised as a Jew, right? But if you look, for example, at the latest demographic study of the greater Washington community, less than 50% of all kids who are being raised as Jews have any formal Jewish education whatsoever. Right? So, you know, what does that mean when it says, when I, you know, I say I'm a Jew married to a non-Jew, I'm raising my kids as Jews, but we don't belong to a shul, they're not going to Hebrew school. You know, it's, I mean, it very, very, I mean, you can make the data say whatever you want, right? But I do think, you know, I mean, the data does show that the majority of Jews married to non-Jews say that they are raising their kids with a Jewish identity.
But what percentage of 2 Jewish parent families are sending their kids to Hebrew school or to shul?
No, I mean, that 50% number is everybody. It's not just the intermarried, right? So it's higher, but it's certainly not universal. For sure not universal. Yeah, Alan.
Couple of things. Number one, when you respond to Rabbi Wertheimer, you might, and I'm not going to get this right, I don't have the quote in my head exactly right, but Proust talked about one of his characters in a book, and he said, having never fallen in love, he assumed it was a rational process where you went back and forth and made a decision based on logic and your intellect, and then you got married. In point of fact, it's quite the opposite. You fall in love, and it's a very emotional thing, and it's something that once you've done it, you understand. And one of the speakers that we had said, you know, this business about saying, well, my child's going to marry a non-Jew. He said, that's horrible. He said, this is a person that they love. This is a person that they want to spend their life with, and there's positive qualities for that. And so, that's the one thing. But secondly, Rabbi, what's your thought? I mean, so you pointed it out that people are leaving. A lot of people aren't going to synagogue to raise their children and to educate their children. What should we do? What's your thought?
Your guess is as good as mine. I really, I think our shul is constrained at this point by its small size, right? In other words, the Cineplex idea is a good one, right? That is to say, have one service that is more or less what we're doing now for the people who like that. Okay, and then a shorter, more liberal, more English service for the people who like that, right? But in order to do that, you need the critical mass, both in terms of somebody who's able to, I can't be in two places at once, and you need a critical mass of people who are gonna attend that, right? And that was tried, in the past. I think that, Jewish education is key, right? I think that if you look at organizations in our community that are thriving, that are not shuls, right? The Haberman Institute is very, very successful, right? I don't know that we necessarily should compete with them, right? But accessible Jewish education for people who might be interested, in checking us out, right? But I think the reality is that every synagogue has a catchment area, right? People are not going to drive 45 minutes to come to our shul, driving past 10 other shuls to get here, right? And as long as we are determined to remain a conservative shul, there's only so much that we can do, right? So, this is a reality. We located ourselves in an area where there was growth at the time, and there isn't, right? So to me, I think it's not, as you put your finger, it's not just a question of appealing to Jews married to non-Jews. It's a question of appealing to Jews, with less background than most of our members, and perhaps with less traditional inclinations than most of our members, while still being attractive to the people for whom what we're doing already works. Yes, Sue.
Well, I had a couple of little comments. First of all, Rabbi, when you said about Jews not raising their kids, with a Hebrew education or religious school, I myself have a cousin who, the whole family was Jewish. They were Jewish. Their parents were Jewish and grandparents married another Jewish person. And they had one child, a boy, and just decided they didn't want to be bothered with Hebrew school or a bar mitzvah. When other members of the family did send their kids to religious school and did have bar mitzvahs, including this one person's brother and his, wife. So, the rest of us couldn't understand it. And quite frankly, I was rather shocked. They always come to holidays. They're not any other religion. They just didn't want to be bothered. The other thing is, while you were talking, I was thinking of the Western Wall, where anyone, whether you're Jewish or not, can come up to the wall and say a prayer and put in, a little piece of paper with a prayer in it. But at the same time, I'm thinking that it really is important to keep the traditions, especially a conservative synagogue. People can do whatever they want to do when it comes to kids and marriage, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that every institution has to go along with every trend. I think that it's important to be inclusive, but I think it's important to also have some barriers and restrictions so you maintain, the values and the structure of the synagogue itself. And one other thing is, it reminds me of years ago at Kialat Shalom, when my kids were attending religious school, and we went to a meeting. It was like after the first report card or whatever, and all the parents are sitting around in the evening, and the teachers explaining the curriculum and what they're doing, and the report cards, and people are asking questions. And all of a sudden, one of the parents stands up and says, "Well, I don't understand why you don't believe in Jesus and why he's not taught here." And all of us turned around and looked, and her child, she was an intermarried couple, and her child was attending. And I have no problem asking a question, but number one, it seemed incredible to me that she'd have a child going to a Jewish school and not understand that, plus asking it at what seemed like an inappropriate time. And also her attitude was such that she just couldn't get it, and she wanted to know why. So I think that it's good to be inclusive, but at the same time, you do have to recognize that if you change too much to be inclusive, you do have other situations you're going to have to deal with.
Right. Well, look, I think, people, I would say the following. We have a bat mitzvah coming up in a couple of weeks, and it is an interfaith family, and they moved here a couple of years ago from Miami, and they belong to a Reformed synagogue in Miami, and then and it was a small synagogue, and they had a close relationship with the rabbi. And then when they moved up here, they said, we want a small synagogue where we can have a close relationship with the rabbi, right? And so they joined us, and I'm going through them. They said, yeah, we understand, okay, that we chose to join a conservative synagogue, right? And therefore there are certain things that we were able to do for our two sons' bar mitzvahs that we can't do for our daughter's bat mitzvah, like take pictures during the service, as an example, right? And that has nothing to do with intermarried or not intermarried, right? But they understand that we have different rules than the place they belong to, in Miami did, right? But I think also one of the things that I think is really important is tone, right? I mean, is that, when I was a younger, newly minted rabbi, I would occasionally give sermons about why it was important for Jews not to marry non-Jews. Okay, I haven't given such a sermon in over 20 years, right? And I wouldn't, right? I mean, just the tone in terms of, because for all kinds of including the fact that it doesn't work, right? Nobody's ever said, well, I was going to marry somebody who I really love, but the rabbi gave a sermon, so now I won't, right? I mean, it's just, aside from any other, it's ineffective, right? And I mean, so Alan, in terms of the response to Wertheimer, who, by the way, is not a rabbi. He's a professor and a PhD, but he's not a rabbi. One of the lines that I wrote in this article is that, Wertheimer gives us a barrage of statistics which purport to prove that intermarriage is detrimental to the Jewish future. But as rabbis, we don't deal with statistics, we deal with individuals. Right? And that's the thing. I mean, the statistics are what they are, right? But if I'm dealing with a Jewish family, there's not an 80% chance that they will or won't raise their kid as a Jew, right? In that sense, it's kind of binary. They either will or they won't, right? And what can I do to help them to do that, right? In fact, I mean, if they're in my office, they probably already made an a priori decision that they are going to raise their kid as a Jew, right? So what can I do to lower those barriers and to make the synagogue a friendly and welcoming place, right? Because again, statistics are statistics, but I mean, if I can be forgiven, right? If we go by statistics, right, the average person, right, the average person has one breast and one testicle, right? But have you ever met such a person, right? I mean, we don't deal with averages of statistics, right? We deal with individuals. And I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with individuals, not statistics.
Well, when you're too rigid, you'll always lose people. But then if you're too loose, you'll lose them anyway. You won't mean anything.
Right. I mean, but I think attitude goes a long way, right? Now, if I can, we're going to run over a little bit, right? But here is where I stand, at least today, right? I can't accept patrilineal descent. I don't think that we have the ability to unilaterally change the criteria of who is born as a Jew. I do think that we should make conversion of children of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother as easy as possible, assuming that they want to be part of our shul and want to raise their kids as Jews. But I think we have to insist on conversion, not necessarily like before we can accept them to kindergarten, but they need to know, if your kid is not halakhically Jewish, you can enroll them in Hebrew school, but they won't have a bar bat mitzvah unless they go through a formal conversion. I think actually intermarriage in a way is easier than patrilineal descent, in the sense that you're not sort of changing fundamental definitions that have historically been universal against among the Jewish community. However, I mean, I could see myself being willing to officiate at an intermarriage in a purely civil capacity. Right? But my gut feeling is that when a couple is looking for a rabbi to do their wedding, that's not what they want, right? In other words, if I could get up there and say, this is not a Jewishly valid marriage, but I am here as a clerk of the court, I could do that. I don't think that makes the couple happy. I just don't think that it solves the problem, right? So, but it has to do with my own sense of my own integrity in terms of not pretending that something is happening that isn't actually happening from the perspective of halacha. But I really, I'm not sure. I don't see the law committee changing on this. I just don't, right? Because just as the ritual committee tends to attract more traditional people in a shul, the law committee tends to attract people who are more knowledgeable in halacha, and therefore if they're more knowledgeable in halacha, they tend to be more traditional. right? Now, if there is really a lot of pressure from rabbis to be permitted to officiate at intermarriages, then people may either try to figure out a way to circumvent the law committee or just go ahead and do it. And like right now, for sure, I mean, there have been conservative rabbis who have challenged this position and they've been kicked out of the RA. All right. And they knew that that was likely to happen. It's one thing to kick out 3 or 4 rabbis. Would they kick out 100 rabbis or 200? I don't know. So, I don't know. I just don't know where this is going. I mean, I do think that if it's going to change, it's probably not going to change like in the next 5 years or so. And being age 62, you can do the math. We're going over, but that's okay. I'll shut up again. And if there are any, more comments or questions or whatever, I'd, be really happy to hear them. Anyone? I've either bullied you into silence, or everybody either agrees with everything that I said or just too tired to care. All right. Well then, thank you and good night.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
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 Night.